Welcome to 4 News for Wednesday, November 11th, 2015. I'm Nikira John. Thank you so much for joining us. During this special edition of 4 News, we take a look at some of the biggest changes being proposed to the National Parks Ordinance and Regulations. DEMA has conducted public consultations on the proposed amendments to the ordinance. Around 40 persons, which included landowners in the Chalk Sound National Park, attended the most recent meeting on Providence Isles. While there were many positive elements outlined in the proposal, such as the granting of ticketing powers to conservation officers and the allowance of traditional fishing to support the livelihood of fishermen in protected areas, the changes proposed to the boundary line of the Chalk Sound National Park has captured the attention of environmental advocates residing in the TCI. Former Director of the Department of Environment and Maritime Affairs, Kathleen Wood, headed the department from August 2012 to August 2014. During that time, she chaired a committee that conducted and completed a review of the National Parks Ordinance just before her resignation in August 2014. The committee comprised of civic groups and members from the private and public sector. In this extended news report, Wood, along with the chairman of the TCI Reef Fund, Don Stark, weighs in on some of the concerning changes being proposed from an environmentalist perspective. Proposals are being made for the boundary line of the Chalk Sound National Park in Providence Isles to be extended and refined at different points, which have set some conservationists abuzz. The new proposed adjustments to the National Parks Ordinance is expected to, among other things, find a permanent resolution for the historical error made by the former PNP government, which created and sold off hundreds of residential and commercial land within the protected areas of the Chalk Sound National Park and Pigeon Pond and Frenchman's Creek Nature Reserve.
The amendments that are now being put forward by DEMA, some of them are recommendations that came from that committee, but some of them are not. So I can't really speak to where those other recommendations came from. Some of the recommendations that are new, that did not come from the committee as far as I'm aware, because I did leave shortly after that committee finished its work.
Nearly 109 residential lots created in the Chalk Sound National Park and 89 commercial lots in the Pigeon Pond and Frenchman's Creek Nature Reserve are earmarked to be excluded from the current boundary line. This exclusion is being pushed to facilitate developments, including the marina dock for Turks Caicos development around Pirates Cove. 7 protected parcels are also up for reclassification near the Amanyara Resort in Northwest Point. The government is proposing to allow owners of undeveloped lots, which are proposed to be excluded from the national park's boundary, to undergo a mandatory self-funded environmental impact assessment prior to building. But some residents are adamant the undeveloped lots should remain no building zones and the government should reimburse landowners instead of feeding a major environmental error.
Taking land out of the Pigeon Pond, Frenchman's Creek Nature Reserve was not a recommendation that was made by the committee. In fact, a report was done, 2 reports were done by a group of experts in 2006, around 2006, called Nautilus Consultants. And I worked on one of those consultancies as a terrestrial expert. And what that study found was that the Pigeon Pond Frenchman's Creek Nature Reserve is the most important ecological asset in the national park system on Providenciales, and there's a number of reasons for that, but the main reason is because there just isn't any protected land on Provo. All of the protected areas around Providenciales are either wetland areas or marine protected areas, and so that little reservoir of unfragmented vegetation is critical to preserving the biodiversity of Providencialis and to maintaining some naturalness that the children for future generations are going to be able to appreciate and enjoy. You know, with all the development that's taking place here, I'm sure, you know, in your lifetime you've seen tremendous differences, and it's very conceivable that in the next generation there just won't be any natural areas left, and that's why that park is so critical. And to remove it is a grave mistake, and I can't, there is no environmental justification for doing so. In fact, the environmental rationale for keeping it in the park is much stronger than any argument that could possibly be made to take it out.
Those commercial lots that by the entrance to Silly Creek that are not yet developed, which were acquired illegally, should not be taken out of the park. The residential lots in that one corner of Chalk Sound National Park where people have built houses, I think there needs to be some sort of compromise to take care of those people who unwittingly purchase land there and build homes. From a standpoint, adding more land and water to the national parks is a great thing to help protect the heritage. But there are certain areas that are being carved out that are important areas that shouldn't be carved out. And I think we'll be sacrificing some of that heritage, like Pirates Cove, where you've got the rock carvings up on the top of the hill. That's going to be taken out, and who's going to protect that from commercial exploitation? So,
you know, with the housing situation in Chalk Sound, where certain people were allowed to move in, build homes, and they had their land there, and many of them without knowledge that, you know, that was in the protected area, it becomes a human rights issue at that point, where you have people who've made the largest investment of their lives, building a home, having a mortgage to pay, and you know, there has to be a little bit of human compassion there. Should it have ever been allowed to happen? No. But now that it has happened, you know, you have to have a little bit of wiggle room. You have to understand that there's a human element involved, and people are actually living there. I think that there's justification for taking those lots out of the national park. We did discuss the fact that under the study that was done in 2006 suggested that a buffer be placed between the Chalk Sound National Park and the airport and the north shore of Chalk Sound.
The island of Silly Key, nestled between Silly Creek, Emerald Key, and Chalk Sound, is also earmarked to be excluded from the national park boundary line. The island is advertised on one real estate website as a private paradise island with a 10.1-acre lot priced at $8 million. If Silly Key is currently and was always a protected area, why is it now privatized? Despite this, without any clear justification, it later recommends that this particular key, along with its surrounding waters up to Silly Pond, be taken out of the Chalk Sound National Park boundaries. The government also wants to establish a shark and ray sanctuary within TCI's economic enterprise zone and a marine mammal sanctuary along the Turks Bank to protect whales and other marine mammals. The whale watching industry in the TCI has very few cemented rules for what divers can and cannot do in the cetaceans environment. But this proposal has raised many eyebrows, particularly because it suggests a clash in the government's values, some feel. Environmental advocate Don Stark says the contradiction is clear. The same government that wants to protect mammals from commercial exploitation off the shores of Grand Turk also supports the Grand Turk Dolphinarium project, a recreational creek with captive dolphins.
It makes the country look stupid. You're going to create a marine mammal sanctuary. That means you're protecting marine mammals. It doesn't make any sense then to have a captive dolphin facility in the midst of that sanctuary. And by the way, I don't understand why they just want to make the Turks Banks the marine mammal sanctuary. I think it should be the whole country.
To the inexpert reader, the proposed inclusion of the phrase wise use to the national park's ordinance means very little, but embedding this phrase in the ordinance paves the way for an open-ended interpretation which environmentalists say could create a travesty. Prior to 2013, there was an outright ban on the removal of sand, rock, coral rag, or any calcareous substance from any national park. The ordinance was then altered to allow the removal of these only for traditional use in 2013. At the time, this was the only amendment made to the National Parks Ordinance. Now the government proposes to reword the regulation again from traditional use to, quote, wise use.
That term is a very controversial term. It's very vague, which is, there's no room for anything vague in a legal document like that because it allows too much wiggle room. One of the beautiful aspects from a legislative standpoint of the National Parks Ordinance is that it's very unequivocal. It's very easy to use it as a law or a group of laws because it says basically very clearly you can do this, you cannot do that. And some other laws in the country are a little bit sort of maybe, you know, you shall not or you should not. And so, but the National Parks Ordinance is actually quite a beautiful piece of legislation in that it's very unequivocal about what you can and cannot do. So any changes that change that, I think are dangerous because wise use doesn't mean anything unless it's clearly defined. There is a movement, an anti-environmental movement in the United States that's called the Wise Use Movement that promotes actually taking land from the public and putting it into private hands to allow them to exploit the public's assets to their economic gain. So this is not wording that belongs in an ordinance that is, its sole stated purpose is to protect the environment for future generations. And so that is of great concern. I think we did change the wording a few years ago to allow for traditional access. And I think that that wording is sufficient to allow people, you know, if there was some storm and people couldn't get in and out of South Dock or people couldn't get in and out of the Leeward Channel, then there's certainly some justification for allowing for some clearance to continue the traditional use. But when you use a terminology like wise use, you could open that up to anything. And the sad reality would be it wouldn't just be the Leeward Channel. It would be any national park in the country would be open for a cruise port or a shipping port or any use of that nature, which is completely antithetical to the whole purpose of the National Parks Ordinance.
Well, wise use is a terminology, a phrase that's becoming more widely used in legal circles as a counter to the environmental movement. Its intention, as I understand it, is to provide the opportunity for the government, in this instance, to define what they consider to be wise use, which is kind of a scary thing because it basically gives this government or any future government the right to do whatever they believe would be wise use of the national parks. So, for example, if they thought putting a cruise ship terminal in the middle of Grace Bay was wise use of the Princess Alexandra Land and Sea National Park, they could do it, and they could blast and dredge a 40-foot deep channel straight in from the reef. The wise use issue would be a disaster because you might as well not even have national parks then, because it basically gives the government an opportunity to ignore any protections that are there.
But it must be highlighted that there are many positive elements and amendments being proposed for the National Parks Ordinance. These include the extension of the boundaries of nearly a dozen ecologically sensitive areas and nature reserves. The views of residents vocalized at this recent consultation on proposed amendments to the National Parks Ordinance will be collated and tendered to Cabinet.
All legislation is a living document. Of course, it has to change according to the times and according to the needs of the public at the time. I think, and that's why we changed the original document, which said you shall not remove any sand, rock, coral rag, to say except to maintain traditional navigational use. Because we did have a situation where, you know, the government dock on Grand Turk is in a national park. The government dock on South Caicos is in a national park, so there are situations where you might actually need to remove some sand to allow boats to get in to maintain the traditional use. So I think that that was a good change. Others would disagree with me. Other people think it shouldn't have been changed at all. But I think that that was justified under those circumstances. We certainly can't allow navigation to be impeded, especially where traditional livelihoods are concerned. On the other hand, there is a grave danger in allowing the document to be too flexible. And you know, the National Parks Ordinance was created to protect and preserve the most important ecological assets of the Turks and Caicos Islands for future generations. And we know, just from the short 20 or 30-year period that we've all been living in, how quickly land disappears in this country for development. And there is a very real and grave threat that land that is in the protected areas will be taken over for private use. That is land that belongs to everybody, and nobody should be allowed to have it for their personal gain.
Nakira John, 4 News. Now, we were hoping to get an interview with the current Director of the Department of Environment and Maritime Affairs, but we were told that he is currently out of the country on government business. We also reached out to the head of the Turks and Caicos Islands National Trust, who reserved her comment at this stage. I'm Nakira John. Thank you so much for watching this special edition.